محمد أحمد جامعة إنديانا بنسلفانيا، ويلقي البحث عنه الدكتورة لينز. البحث الرابع ترجمة نصوص الإنجيل بين الدين واللغة والثقافة، دكتور إيهاب موسى كلية الألسن جامعة مينيا. البحث الخامس اللغة الإنجليزية كلغة ثانية، الطالبة غادة نادي كلية الألسن جامعة مينيا. الآن سنبدأ بعرض البحث الأول. طبعا قبل ما نبدأ في عرض أي بحث من الأبحاث، الهدف من الأبحاث هو إثراء حركة الدراسات العليا، ومعنا الأستاذ الدكتور وكيل الدراسات العليا الدكتور إبراهيم حامد. بالنسبة لكم كطلاب في المرحلة الجامعية أو بالنسبة لطلبة الدراسات العليا، المفروض إنك بتحضر علشان تلتقط فكرة ما تقوم على أساسها البحث أو رسالة الماجستير أو الدكتوراه بتاعك. وطبعا احنا we are limited by time.
بس أحب أسجل صراحة إعجابي بقسم اللغة الإنجليزية دكتور ياسر، وبالذات بتوع قسم اللغة الإنجليزية أنا يعني ممتن لهم جميعا، لأن هم عامل أساسي في نجاح الأسبوع الثقافي. يعني أسجل شكري وامتناني للثراء وعبيد، والله بالفعل يعني ما شاء الله اللغة الفرنسية حقيقي من زمان أو من فترة كبيرة وهم باذلين جهد مشكور جدا جدا، وأحييكم ويعني أشجعكم مزيد من المجهود.
متواجدين دائما صراحة في كل الفعاليات
السنة القادمة إن شاء الله.
Okay, we'll begin with the first paper, the untranslatable problems of translating the Egyptian Mawwāl of Shafiqa and Metwally into English. The Egyptian Mawwāl, equivalent to the ballad form, has already been transmitted from generation to generation and from place to place via the narrator and his chorus, accompanied by traditional Egyptian musical instruments, played in order to create an appropriate soundtrack which helps convey the moral lesson around which the narrative revolves. When it comes to translating the Mawwāl of Shafiqa and Metwally, many problems arise, oral, cultural, and phonological. Problems emanating from cultural differences and from the discrepancy between the Mawwāl as an oral performance and its written translation, the translation and transmission of sounds and sensations, and the translation of Upper Egypt dialects, stylistic features, and linguistic markers, almost label the Mawwāl as untranslatable. Treating these problems necessitates a deep contextual and cultural understanding, since the verses of Mawwāl are loaded with cultural specifics. Bringing all bearings together, be it as it may, cultural, musical, literary, and linguistic, does not guarantee the translatability of the Mawwāl. Through the theory of appropriation, a text can pass by the stages of inevitably untranslatable, almost untranslatable, till it reaches the stage of appropriately translatable. Arabic language as untranslatable. Actors criticize. Actor is the professor of comparative literature, which is supervising now the translation of Vocabulaire Européen, which was translated by, or which was formed by Barbara Case. I quote Henry Lieber. Just as the anthropologists discover similar process working through diverse cultures, so through our peculiarly specialized branch of the science of man, underlying patterns are to be found. By the science of man, Harry Lieben meant comparative literature, which makes cultural encounters possible. And by comparison, translation can play the role of the mediator. I quote, "Cross-cultural communication depends on translation. Against what advocates of valid literature have done, comparative literature insists on reading texts in the original language. In the translation zone, the new comparative literature, Emily After starts with the idea of untranslatability and ends with the idea that translatability should continually be attempted. The untranslatable refers not only to the difference in meaning of a word or phrase from one language to another, but to the cultural and philosophical issues that may stand behind this difference as well. One can see untranslatability as a basis of borrowing. The untranslatable does not mean the impossibility of translating a word. Rather, it stresses the problematicality that arises from translation. In her book, Against World Literature on the Politics of Untranslatability, Emily Apter discusses the concept of untranslatability as basic to a rethinking of comparative literature, and at the same time, other related fields are focused on. Apter then criticizes translation studies and world literature, highlighting their shortcomings, the most important of which is their negligence of the issue of the untranslatable. I quote, "The right to the untranslatable was blindsided by translation studies. While world literature seemed oblivious to the untranslatable, she criticizes Judith Butler's concept of cultural translation, which reduces the critical issue of sacral untranslatability into one of law and language, seeing an insolvable difficulty, that is to say, how to take sacral untranslatability at its word without secular condescension." In her essay, Untranslatables, A World System, while she introduces the vocabulary European de philosophie, Dictionnaire de Untraduisible by Barbara Casey, which she gradually criticizes after, whether intentionally or unintentionally, misplaced Arabic among the ancient as well as modern European languages, thus denationalizing the Arabs from their linguistic identity, making their heritage unidentifiable as well as untranslatable, with no better claim, a mistake not less dangerously effective than redisability. She then quotes Peter Osborne's and Casey's definitions of the untranslatable, stressing the realization of conceptual, philosophical differences linguistically as well as politically. Given that Arabic is a non-European language, and taking into consideration Osborne's differences between languages that have ever been conveyed through translations, and looking from Casey's geopolitical perspective, Arabic language stands alone as an influence and influenced by European languages. Moreover, in part 2 of her book, Apter, while discussing the fifth untranslatable keyword, world, commenting on how the vocabulary is not exclusive in defining the word world, as it does not include non-European languages. She quotes Arabic as one of the non-European languages, thus contradicting herself. First, she said that Arabic is one of the modern European languages. And then she said that Arabic is an example of non-European languages. Explaining Franco Moriti's notion of the novel's critical apparatus that refers to a wider ecosystem, which focuses on how the semantic field of narrative took shape around keywords such as midrash, monogatari, ziyashwa, and qissa. Apter sees these words as untranslatable, and therefore the Western reader is prompted to reverse the order of comparison, that Western prose forms should be measured against these untranslatable. Apter's view of qissa and other subsequent terms as untranslatable is built on mistranslation. Apter maintains that the Arabic qissa, a generic term for narrative associated with religious instruction, qualified less untranslatable or less translatable than, say, the mathal, and between two brackets she said fable, the nadira, anecdote, or the sira, chivalric tale, which centered a global curriculum devoted to religious and secular literary expression. She once said that the word qissa in Arabic is related to religious context only. First of all, qissa is not associated with religious instruction, unless one refers to it as the singular form of the plural one, qasas, which means stories narrated in the Holy Quran. Apart from that, qissa is an established literary genre that takes different forms such as al-qissa al-qasira, short story, and al-qissa, longer than the short story, and can roughly be translated as novella. As for mathal, it means a saying or a proverb, and when it is associated with Quran, it means a parable, which is a moral lesson, not a fable, as she said. Nadira is not associated with religion at all. It is associated with a literary form such as maqamat, in which a narrator tells different old stories. Sira, which means chivalric tales, is associated with Arabic literature, as it is the title of many Arabic epics, such as Sirat Abu Zayd al-Hilali, the tale of Abu Zayd al-Hilali, or Sirat Antra bin Shaddad, the tale of Antra bin Shaddad. Put in religious context, Sira means a biography as we have Sirat al-Nabi Muhammad, the biography of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Sirat al-Sahaba, the biography of the companions. Moreover, an actor's mistranslation calls into question the assessment of some untranslatables and necessitates an investigation of a translator's background and mastery of the source language, as well as the target one. After criticizes comparative literature as being self-contradictory in nature, since it claims an inclusion of cultures and at the same time depends on a nationalism to realize its goal, which stresses a new exclusion. Where literature, as she puts it, is more inclusive and with a better claim than comparative literature. After discussing the idea of untranslatability being based on checkpoints, be them physical or figurative, political miscommunications at the border are seen as an example of the untranslatable. To support this point, After seems to quote only literary works and movies related to the Palestinian cause, highlighting the point that Palestine is a non-existent state, a phantom sovereignty. In fact, checkpoints can be representative more of political blockade than untranslatability. After sees checkpoints necessary for the persistence of the function of the state police within the field of language politics. She further emphasizes her point, I quote, checkpoints, whether mobile bodies or stationary landmarks, produce a logic of anti-sovereign occupation, contoured by walls of non-transitivity and untranslatability. In her attempt to put the two words together, untranslatability and politics, in one phrase, After touches on a crucial issue of political subversion of the Palestinian struggle for the right of regaining their occupied territories, making Palestine a phantom sovereignty, which is untranslatable. Quoting Orhan Pamuk, who wrote about the origin of the word huzn, After seems to deliberately misplace and misspell the name of Muhammad's prophet's wife Khadija. I quote, the Prophet Muhammad referred to the year in which he lost both his wife Hatis. Have you ever heard about Hatis as Khadija? She said so. Her name is Hatis. And his uncle Abu Talib, Sanatul Huzn, the year of melancholy. Actually, After gives a good example of how a translator, through lack of reliable source of knowledge or deliberate distortion of facts, can create the chimera of untranslatability. She makes an unjustifiable generalization when she syllogistes seeing Abdel Fattah Khalid's injunction, as she likes to call it, representing the duty to not translate as being derived from Islamic tradition. I quote, the duty to not translate is derived from Islamic tradition. I'm thinking here of Abdel Fattah Khalid's injunction, thou shalt not translate me. Khalid, who is quoted saying, I quote, I dislike having foreigners speak my language, is from Morocco, a country whose population is known for speaking French more than they do their Arabic native tongue. I argue that After tries to make a mountain of a molehill when she discusses Khalid's short story, claiming him the author of an untranslatable Arabic phrase that comes to the narrator in a dream. Then she mentions the untranslatable Arabic phrase and its translation. I quote, this phrase, لغتنا الأعجمية, includes the root أعجم, meaning non-Arab or barbarian, and is rendered in French as notre langue étrangère, literally our foreign tongue. The Arabic phrase is evidently translatable, and there is no philosophy behind this. I think Khalid referred to the Moroccan everyday language, a mix between Arabic and French, with the latter overshadowing the former. After referring to the enigmatic sense of the expression, was successful in one of her suggestions. That's to say, Khalid's phrase may refer to colonized or other speech within one's native tongue. Time and again, After falls in generalization concerning Islam's view of translators, quoting Wa'il S. Hassan, the translator of Khalid's "Thou shalt not speak my language." Hassan recalls too that within much Islamic tradition, translators are readily held to be apostates and heretics, a class of interpreters worthy of punishment, even if they are also qualified for redemption. Hassan is wrong, since Prophet Muhammad encouraged his followers to gain knowledge. For example, he ordered Zayd bin Thabit to learn the Jewish language Zayd said, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, ordered me to learn Jewish speech. I learned it in half a month. Moreover, Prophet Muhammad ordered Zayd bin Thabit bin al-Dahhak al-Ansari, Abu Kharija, to learn the Syriac language in order to read the Prophet's documents in this language. Islam encourages translation so long as the translator is faithful to the ethics of the professional. Contrary to what Hassan has claimed, there have been many translations of the meanings of the Holy Quran. After went too far as to liken what amount to a big historical academic lie made up by Hassan to what happened to Wycliffe, who was opposed, much hated, and even exhumed because he translated the Bible and deprived the church from material gains as he facilitated communication between man and God without a go-between. I quote, as translation martyrs, Wycliffe and Tyndall may be abstracted as examples of how the politics of sacred language becomes implicated in the politics of religious institutions, particularly when what is at issue is control over lay instruction. Quran, whether in Arabic or in translation, calls for direct communication between God and man. I quote a verse from Quran, and when my slaves ask you, O Muhammad, concerning me, then answer them, I am indeed near to them by my knowledge. I respond to the invocations of the supplicant when he calls on me, without any mediator or intercessor. So let them obey me and leave me, so that they may be led aright. Surah Al-Baqarah 186. In a footnote, after communicating with Islam's fatwa of killing authors and translators, gives an example of Salman Rushdie's satanic verses and its translators. Shafiqa and Metwally, between the untranslatable and the appropriated. Creator's view, which after in her book Against Literature approves of that Arabic poetry is untranslatable, is not correct. I quote, Arabic poetry is Creator's model untranslatable, even more than the Quran. For in passing from one language to another, the poem loses rhyme. Once rhyme is sacrificed, poetry turns into something other, which is to say, prose. Translation, according to Creator, cuts the poetic thread, the very same thread that organizes and regulates the cosmos. A translator should do his best to appropriate, to build a bridge between Arabic and foreign poetic forms. In my paper, Nizar Kabbani's Baltis translation into English, with an introduction that was published by the New Presses Sorbonne University, I argued that translation falters between mechanical and metrical versions of the original. Undoubtedly, poetry uses much of its music, sweetness, and harmony in translation. Be it noted that each poet has a peculiar way of expressing his thoughts, presenting to the reader ungrammatically structured poems using poetic license. It's the translator's task, your task, to make up for such losses. A translator deals with each poem as an independent, separate case, assuming the impracticality of a common set of rules. For a translator to accomplish his task properly, thorough knowledge of the source language and its culture is a must. Thus, contextual relation to the target text can be derived. A translator, through a modification paradigm, can freely convey the message of the source text into the target text, taking into consideration the appropriation of diction, figures of speech, rhyme, and rhythm as much as possible. By so doing, the result will be a well-groomed literary work rather than a lateral translation. For the sake of time, problems of translating Shafiqa and Metwally. Now I'm going to just set in front of you some problems I faced while translating Shafiqa and Metwally. In translating Shafiqa and Metwally, different problems arise, making the work almost untranslatable. These problems show themselves at different levels: oral, cultural, phonological. Oral level. The Mawwāl comes under oral poetry, and being sung in Upper Egyptian dialect makes it so difficult to write down in order for it to be translated. Too much effort should be exerted in listening to the Mawwāl. The listening takes different levels, introducing the Mawwāl to the ear, grasping it as musically contextualized narrative, listening to each stanza at different times in order to decipher the highly assimilated sound and syllables, writing each stanza carefully, and finally scrutinizing the written version while listening attentively. The inner ear will grasp the ideal structure of the Mawwāl. Cultural context. it's impossible to find two identical cultures since the environmental as well as the biological genes differ from place to place. However, underlying patterns can be found through diverse cultures. Shafiqa and Metwally can drag little attention when translated into a European language since the cultural context of the source differs from the context of the target text. However, the basic issue that is disapproval of a disgraceful behavior by a family or community member can be traced back in English literature. For example, in the early 20th century, D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love was banned because it contained explicit sexual scenes. Thomas Hardy's The Mayor of Casterbridge portrayed a skeneterized scene. A skeneterized scene هو التجريس باللغة العربية. حمارة وبالمقلوب نركب كده اثنين ونجرسهم في البلد. It was there in the 19th century. It was there as a scene in The Mayor of Casterbridge, skeneterized scene in which two effigies representing the guilty were set on a donkey touring the village in order to express the disapproval of the community. Similarly, the story of Shafiqa and Metwally revolves around the disgraceful behavior of a sister who abandoned her aged father when her brother joined the army, only to become a whore. Upper Egyptian traditions necessitates that the disgraceful should be killed so that the family's honor is not stained. The most important points in the story, the exposition, the beginning, the climax, and the resolution, may be missed or dislocated by the target reader, whose culture allows women and men who are not married to each other to have sex as an expression of freedom. Listeners or readers are exposed to the conflict when Metwally is taunted by a new recruit who keeps Shafiqa's photo in his pocket. He said, I'm quoting from the Mawwāl. Now in Arabic first, قالوا ازاي بتضربني يا جبان؟ روح اكتب نفسك جوا جبانة ادي صورة اختك جوا جيبانة يا متولي. It is translated as follows. He said, how dare you slap me at the face, coward. He said, how dare you slap me, or slap my face covered, going to a grave and yourself high? Your sister's photo is in my pocket. The climax is realized in the encounter of Shafiqa and Metwally. Metwally gives his reasons for the murder he is going to commit. قال يا شفيقة بعديه التوبي وتتمحكي وتقولي مكتوبي دي رجعة ما تطلعش من توبي. So he gives his own reasons. Saying, she said, take me and I repent at your hands. He said, you want to repent after what you did? To implore me and say you are destined, my honor is forever stained. The resolution for Metwally and the rest of the community is complete when he faces the society honorably, announcing that he has cleared his honor. وطلع البلكونة بسكنته قال جرح في قلبي سكنته يا ناس وسعوا لي سكنته. With his knife he entered the balcony. He said, in my heart I appeased an agony. You people, away from me. Okay? Defining the tripartite structure the narrative is based on is essential for a target reader who is alien to this deeply rooted cultural behavior to fully grasp and enjoy the printed text. Phonological level. In oral poetry, phonological and musical aspects are complementary. For example, accompanied by suitable musical instruments, the narrator plays phonological games such as homonym, anaphora, represented in the repetition of a phrase, a line, or sometimes more than one line with slight phonological variation. Performing in low and high pitch is impossible to transmit through a written translation, unless it is appropriate. This is appropriation theory I'm driving on. Prolongation of a word or a syllable emphasizing an incident in the narrative is another level of problematicality. How can I translate وزرت دي جلال في بلادكم? How can you translate this prolongation of the syllable جلال? You can, of course, but you have to have some kind of appropriation of the text. The climax is realized, I said this before, the first challenge that faced me when I thought of translating the Mawwāl was the task of writing it down, as I said before. Look at this example of homonym, okay, which is appropriated into homophones. كلام يشبه سلاح ماضي للمؤلف على الورق ماضي ودي حادثة في العهد الماضي. You have three ماضيs. It is written the same, it is pronounced the same, but the meaning is different. So this is homonym. The rhyming word madi is exactly repeated. However, each time it means something different. The translation tries to make up for the homonymic influence found in the original. This is the translation. These words are like a sharp weapon. On papers with the author's name we open. A murder last epic did happen. The rhyming words are not the same, but still they cause a similar sound. Weapon and we open are somehow homophonic. Therefore, translation of sounds can be appropriately done. This is the most impossible, or the most difficult part in translating or in poetry. How can I translate sounds? Through the appropriation scheme. The source shows examples of homonym with slight variation resulting from two sounds being assimilated. يا ابو زين عندك فدار بالنور وشبابيكك في الدار بالنور. Again, the narrator is repeating the two lines but with a slight variation. يا ابو زين عندك فدار بالنار وشبابيكك في الدار بالنار دي خد شريطه في دار بالنار. It is translated as follows. Oh handsome, you have lights in mass. Your windows home are of shining glass. The repetition. Oh handsome, you have fiery lights in mass. Your windows home are of fiery shining glass. In a shooting test he got a rank plus. The repetition of binar and this variation banur is appropriated in the translation into the anaphora mass and glass. The slightly variated homonym is appropriated in an anaphoric rhyme. So we can appropriate homonym, as we said before, in homophone or in an anaphoric rhyme. An example of heteronym stresses the verbal ingenuity of the narrator and illustrates the difficulty of translating it. قال له أنا رايس، قال له أنا راجل رايس، قال له أنا راجل رايس كلمتين والحب بهدل كل متين عايز أجابلها في كلمتين. Okay, it is written the same ميم تاء يا نون but with different pronunciation. It is translated as follows. I am a foreman for a group of 200. Not even the strongest could resist qubit. With Shafiqa, I would like to have a word. The first two lines in the source show perfect heteronym with the repetition of the same word matin, but with different pronunciation. First as metin, second as matin. The rhyming word in the third line is an imperfect heteronym of its second syllable, kil mitin. The heteronym cannot exactly be kept in translation. However, the three different rhyming words in the target text ending with that sound make up for the heteronym effect of the source. Another example that shows a perfect heteronym in the source and an almost perfect one in translation. ناس على رجوليته شاريطين وكان في بلده شاريطين وترجى واخد شاريطين. Translated into, some people swear by his manhood and in his village he bought a plot of land. He was promoted and in 2 ranks high did he stand. The word sharitin in the first line differs from that in the second line if it is written. So you write ناس على رجوليته شاريطين شين را يه طا. But if you write sharitin, you write shin alif. But because it is pronounced, it will be the same. But since the Mawwāl is basically oral performance, I wrote down the words as they were spoken to appropriate the use of heteronym into a translated equivalent one and is added to the fifth line so that it can form an imperfect heteronym with land and stand. Another phonological problem is rhyme created bun, a bun which is created from the rhyme. The narrator improvises as he narrates the Mawwāl, which results in an ingenious bun perceived only after the listener has attentively listened for many times. Please listen to this. له عائلة كريمة يقدموا علبتهم مربطينهم علبتهم روح وخبط على بيتهم. The second rhyme word علبتهم can be understood in 2 ways. A phonological variation suggesting either the first rhyming word علبتهم or the third rhyming word على بيتهم. So علبتهم can be understood as this. علبتهم means علة بيتهم or علبتهم is علبتهم. So the bun comes from here. Both are signs of generosity. علبتهم either understood as at their house or at their box. It's a sign of generosity. We want to say that Metwally's family is generous. The bun is translated into the phrase in its best quality. And its best quality shows generosity in its best quality, suggesting the 2 meanings. Addition of instantly is acceptable since it is implied as the context reveals a curious and irritable protagonist who is eager to discover the truth. Conclusion. The three levels of problematicality, that's to say oral, cultural, and phonological, interconnected so much that they form an inseparable whole, the decipherment of which is almost impossible, is the basis for any good translation of Mawwāl. Through appropriation, a target text can be easily understood by a non-Arab reader. Thank you all for listening.
طبعا يعني حقيقي انا بالرغم ان انا يعني لا انتمي الى اللغه الانجليزيه ويعني ولكن حقيقي ما قدمه دكتور ياسر انا استمتعت من بساطه اللغه بتاعته ومن الخوض عميقا في المواويل الشعبيه والتراث الشعبي بتاعنا بالذات في الصعيد. فانا اشكرك يا دكتور ياسر على البحث الجميل الشيق وعلى ما قدمت. يعني
شكرا جزيلا دكتور ابراهيم. والعلم الرئيس حكمي قال هذا الموال قاله في باريس من سنوات طويله. العالم الغربي يتعطش الى تراثك العربي، ودي دعوه لجميع المشتغلين بالبحث لا دراسات عليا ماجستير ودكتوراه. ارجوكم انطلقوا تراث. العالم الغربي يتعطش الى تراثنا الجميل. Now I call upon Dr. Lamis to give her oral presentation on behalf of